Thank you. It's a pleasure and an honor to tag team with BJ. We've been interacting for 25 years or so, almost. And Jay Geed, who snuck in after lunch, was part of that little trio. We all started around the same time, I think. To be part of this extraordinary panel and program. And one of the themes that's been pervasive today has been the puzzling misalignment between the resources that societies all over the world dedicate towards alleviating the burdens of mental illness and those burdens. There are many reasons for that. Many of those are local. But I would suggest that one of them is the other reality, which was also voiced by someone from the audience, that we're talking about the most complex organ. This makes rocket science look easy. And what we don't understand frightens many of us. And I remember as a child wondering why adults were whispering, and it turns out they were talking about someone having cancer. Because back then you didn't talk about that out loud because it was so frightening. Because cancer was tantamount to a death sentence. And heart disease had its own imponderables. FDR died of malignant hypertension that nowadays could be treated like that, but back then it was a tragedy that involved the entire nation. And what happened, not maybe as a direct connection to that, but the Framingham study started in 1948, and I'm sure it wasn't designed to, have all of the results that it did. But from tracking those individuals over the decades, it became obvious that there were risk factors, that those could be approached, that blood pressure needed to be controlled, cholesterol turned out to be important, statins were developed. It's a long developing story. Similarly, many cancers are treatable. Many are curable. I don't mind telling you that I had prostate cancer surgery this summer because I think it's gone. And so that's part of what happens when we feel that we have more of a handle. So that's part of why the Brain and Behavior Research Foundation, and I know that this is the believers, you're here and you know this, but this is why this is so important, because it's so dedicated towards bringing an understanding to these mysterious entities. And so that's part of what I will take you through. BJ, Jay, and I went to NIMH to train with Judy Rappaport, and one day she said to me, "Your job is to figure out what ADHD is." And I said, "Okay, I'm going to try." Not there yet, but I'll take you through where we are with that. Again, I won't take you through each of these, but it's diagnosable with almost the second best reliability in the DSM-5 field trials after autism. And the good news is many individuals with ADHD go on to have very productive, happy lives, but not all. And Rochelle Klein, who sort of has done the polishing on the training that Judy started, and has been a real pleasure to work with since coming to New York, has the longest longitudinal study of ADHD, because these are individuals that she diagnosed back in 1970, between 1970 and 1977, and has followed over 4 waves. And when we brought them back now about 10 years ago, we found that there were 8 times as many non-medical deaths in those individuals who are hyperactive boys as in the control group. 1 out of about close to 200 versus 10 out of about that same number. It was remarkable. And other groups are confirming the same pattern, which is that this is not simply annoying or, in many cases, made up and it's all, a fiction. Rather, it can have the worst of outcomes, and that's not even to talk about the dramatically increased rates of incarceration, drug abuse, etc. So it's also a real problem. It has all of the same issues as we've been hearing about. There is comorbidity with everything else, including anxiety disorders, etc. Although I'm not going to focus on that here, because again, we've tried to figure out how do we get to begin this process of untangling these complex conditions. And about 13 years ago now, Rosemary Tannock and I had a chance to think about this. And at the time, there were two papers that had noticed that there was evidence of increased variability in reaction time tasks. And when we thought about those, it really resonated that that was more than just a simple observation on a computer test, that seemed to be a characteristic that fit the entire phenotype of individuals with ADHD, which is that some days they're terrific, and other days you go, huh, what's going on? And that variability, that lack of consistency, may be the most consistent characteristic. And so we suggested that in a review in 2002, and followed that up a few years later by, again, looking at reaction time consistency, how consistent someone is. No one is ever perfect, but it turns out that individuals with ADHD are much more variable, and the stimulant medications really normalize that. So we published that in 2005, and also examined this in more detail in terms of the frequency structure. Is there a characteristic rhythm at which this takes place? And we seem to find evidence that, in fact, this does occur relatively slowly, that these are like tides going in and out every 20 to 40 seconds, which is very slow by brain time, where we tend to think of events happening 20 or 40 times per second. So something going on at these very slow fluctuations. And since then, the field has responded to these suggestions by doing follow-up studies. And you've heard that again and again this morning. Once someone finds it once, it's not real until it's found 3, 5, 10, or 20 times. Preferably by people who don't like you. Because then you know they're really doing their best to say, I don't believe that. And if they find it, that's, as far as I'm concerned, as close as we get to the truth when we have that situation. At any rate, I'm not sure how many of these folks don't like me, but 319 papers were summarized recently, which agree that variability is, in fact, highly characteristic or highly, very clear phenotypic trait in ADHD, and not only in ADHD. Again, these things don't just cleave clearly with classifications. Around that same time, in parallel, there was a whole beginning recognition of low-frequency phenomenon in the brain. And I had come at this from a different path, from observing that sort of phenomenon in rat studies, another long story. But in the case of the brain, Mark Rakel, who's one of the pioneers of brain imaging, who's been in this business for 45 years or so, in 2001 coined the term the brain's default mode and identified the brain's default mode network. These colors on these maps are not just pretty, although I think they are, but rather they're statistical values. And it turns out that they indicate parts of the brain that have a tendency to activate and deactivate together in synchrony. It remains a mystery as to why that is, but the fact that it is the case is no longer in doubt. This is probably the most replicated finding in this particular field, which has become known as resting state imaging. You can observe this phenomenon, in a sense, in these squiggly lines, which are giving us a snapshot of brain activity with some approximations in that statement, but a correlate of brain activity. In the frontal part, in these orange squiggles, and this more posterior part in these yellow squiggles. And this is almost raw data, and you don't need a statistical analysis to see that those are highly synchronized. And as I said, that phenomenon is now confirmed thousands of times. It's part of the brain's beating, in a sense. And a huge amount of the brain energy, these mitochondria we've been talking about, is invested in maintaining these relationships. Why? We do not know, but it's probably important. Now, the other reason I'm happy to be here is because I had these ideas in rather complicated and almost Baroque ways when I came to New York. But Rochelle and her husband Don helped me to think through some of them. And 10 years ago, NARSAD, after I submitted a 2-page application, gave me the ability to pursue this. And as you've heard again, that was both very nice to be able to do the work that I wanted to do, but more important than that, the caliber of the scientists in this process meant that this wasn't as crazy as it seemed. And with that vote of confidence, my group and I were able to get a substantial amount of NIH funding. In fact, I think it was like 100 to 1 when you calculate the difference between what NARSAD provided and what NIH has provided since then. And so that's allowed us to carry this forward. And so it's wonderful to be able to say thank you. So a year or two later, Edmund Sanuga-Bark and I have to admit, he twisted my arm because I felt that we were not quite ready to sort of go public with this idea, but we did at his urging, and we said, what if this fluctuating network, which seems to be very intricately communicating with these other regions that BJ has been telling you a little bit about, these prefrontal regions, these top-down regulatory regions. Turns out that from some perspectives, they have a kind of yin-yang interactive relationship. What if there's some aspect of that that's related to these episodic lapses of attention, of discontrol? And so we expressed that in a paper, which we then followed up by examining this in a pilot sample of participants with ADHD. These were adults, and we literally were just doing this to have a sense of, how many people will it take? Are we going to find anything at all of interest? And we stumbled on, again, this default network. In the controls, the colors, again in the red, are showing strong correlation with each other. And in the blue, these anti-correlations, these out-of-phase relationships, which, again, you can see from the back of the room, they're different in the individuals with ADHD. And so we proposed that this region, the posterior cingulate cortex and the precuneus, and its relationship to this other frontal control region might be an important component of this. That instead of looking at a single locus, as you've heard, nothing in the brain happens in a single place. It occurs across large distributed networks of thousands of areas. We're not there. We went to 2. 2 is a lot more than 1. But it's not thousands, but it's on the way. And so we suggested that. And now, Okay. And so we happened to sort of hit this field as it was just taking off. And I won't take you through each of these because it would make you all go to sleep. But the point is that there's been an increasing number of studies that most of them are not dead on in terms of testing this particular hypothesis, but most of them have been relatively consistent with the notion that there is something about this default network and its relationship with other cognitive control networks that's relevant. And I'll show you the one exception here, which is the one in red, which was the smallest of these studies, and so maybe that's part of why it wasn't falling into alignment. More recently, this group at Harvard MGH published a very nice paper, even though the number of participants is not that large. They compared 17 control individuals, young adults by this age, with 35 with ADHD who'd been diagnosed as children. Now, as young adults, 13 of them continue to have ADHD symptoms, and 22 of them are in remission. So they were able to contrast them. And I was very gratified to see, and when I was asked to comment about the paper, I couldn't help but notice that they had confirmed that same kind of pattern in the individuals with persistent ADHD, which is the absence of this coordination, but it wasn't there in the controls or in the ones in remission. And so this story is continuing. Now, one of the realities, again, about the brain is that this is very complicated. And any single imaging study itself gives us so much data, and it takes typically about 6 months of full-time work for one person to take the lead on analyzing the data and writing up a paper, and then there may be 10 other people that are contributing to that, but usually there's one main first author and then a senior author and then a number of other co-authors. And so it's a huge amount of effort that it takes just to find out, did we find this or that? And so a number of years ago, a few of us were at a meeting thinking about, how slow this process is. And we decided, what if we pooled our data and made it available? We would have more data for each of us. But we said, why don't we just, instead of keeping it for ourselves, why don't we make it available to everyone? And so we've been doing that for the past 6 years. In the case of ADHD, we started this with these 8 groups from Hopkins, the Kennedy Krieger Institute, Brown, NYU, Holland, the Neuroimage Group, China, Peking University, Pittsburgh, Oregon, and WashU. And again, made these data sets available, made them easy to get. But as you probably know on the internet, most things never get noticed. So we figured out that the way to get noticed was to make a competition out of it. And we got NIDA to agree to sponsor it. They said, how much will it cost us? I said, not very much. So they agreed that the winner of the competition would get their way paid to the Society for Neuroscience meeting. So it turns out the winners came from Hopkins, and the neuroscience meeting was in DC. So it was a very cheap award. But we created this competition and then let everybody know. And all of a sudden, 50 groups around the world were interested, 21 submitted entries, and there was a lot of interest in trying to use these scans to diagnose ADHD. Now, not because we really thought this was going to happen. The only reward for the contributors was altruism. Counts for something. And if you contributed by a certain date, you got to be a co-author on the paper. And that worked. Because again, these papers become highly cited. And so the consortium paper was led by Damien Fair. And again, I won't take you through, all of this is published, and it would take hours to give you the details. But this was the first time that we were able to differentiate people who have hyperactivity, impulsivity, and inattention from those who are mostly inattentive. And it was because we started with almost 800 scans, and we were able to pull out only the 156 that had the least amount of movement. As you can imagine, there's nothing more boring than being in an MRI scanner that's making a lot of noise, and there's nothing going on. And so people with ADHD, especially kids, tend to move more. Moving is really bad for the images. We can't tell what's going on. And so we had to throw out almost 80% of those data sets in order to get clean data. But we had enough to start with that we're able to get a good clean data set. And so, in fact, we were able to examine that default network, those other cognitive control networks here in the yellow, et cetera, and identify, again, part of the complexity of this. As I said last night, probably the best thing that happened to this field was that in 2010, Nora Volkoff didn't get a flu shot. And so she got the flu, and she didn't go to work for a whole week. I don't know if you know who she is, but she's the director of the National Institute of Drug Abuse. She's also a scientist, continues to work at a high level of science, as well as running a $1 billion institute. And this week, she was off from running NIDA, and she was on her couch, and she downloaded the 1,000 functional connectomes data, and in a week, she and her colleague had written a paper and proved that this could be done. And then a couple years later, they downloaded the ADHD 200 data, and again, by comparing almost 250 children with ADHD to 300 controls, they identified, again, patterns of connectivity of which brain regions are talking to each other more or less effectively that seem to differ in individuals with ADHD from controls. And this fit with what we're learning about reward circuitry, about cognitive control circuits. And another group, this time from the Carolinas, North Carolina at the time, Weigao, again, examined these data. And you've heard about RDoC, this notion that we need to be thinking about psychopathology not as yes or no categories, but as gradients, as mild, moderate, marked, more severe, et cetera. Unquestionably true, but it can go too far in the sense that if you only do that, you will miss situations where there are interactions between dimensional relationships and the categories. Not all dimensional relationships are the same for all people. It seems to matter whether or not you have a diagnosis of ADHD. The brain relationships are different in some cases. And so we had observed that earlier in our own small study. This was now confirmed in a sample size 10 times as large. And even more recently, Chandra Sripada, a very talented psychiatrist and philosopher. We heard a little bit about that earlier this morning, that kind of fusion of those two disciplines, but he actually publishes both in philosophy and in psychiatric neuroscience. I know because I wrote a promotion letter for him recently, and I had never seen one of those kinds of CVs before. But Sripada and colleagues have been very inventive about using these data. And again, looking at the brain in terms of thinking about it as if it were continents by looking at these statistical relationships and separating out function on the basis of those correlations. They've observed differences of both increases and decreases in correlation in individuals, which they're then able to parse out into a finer grain. And so these colors are indicating that there are age-related differences. This is all cross-sectional data, but it's consistent with delays in maturation, which again we've observed from studies that Jay Gita and I started at the NIMH, which Philip Shaw has continued. We know structurally that there's a delay in ADHD of as much as 5 years in terms of when individuals reach the same maturational level, which all of a sudden it makes it much more understandable why they're not as mature Their brains are not. Physically, they may look like they're 14 or 15, but they're really more like an 8, 9, or 10-year-old. So, again, this particular paper focused on exactly that point. So, I would not tell you that we have conclusive proof that we can implicate the default network. There are too many sort of open questions about that, but there's increasing evidence that it's one of the players. Now, that's not exclusively for ADHD. The default network turns out to be hugely important to our sense of self. It's implicated essentially in every psychiatric syndrome or condition, so it's part of who we are. And learning about this has been a fascinating process. On the horizon, and even as we speak, you can order what's called a connectome in a box, which is you get UPS box that contains hard drives with data from almost 600 individuals who are part of a study that NIH funded. And these can be analyzed and are being analyzed by individuals all over the world. There are a whole series of initiatives that are going to be coming down the line, including the ABCD study. And BJ Casey, who you just heard, is one of the leaders of one of the competing consortia that is working out the details of this. And so NIH is committed to support the recruitment of 10,000 10-year-olds who are going to be studied for 10 years. It will be the Framingham of adolescent psychiatry. Those data will be made public as they're collected so that the whole worldwide community can access this. And so I would say to you that we're on the verge of being able to use these beginning perspectives, all of this rough work, as a way of formulating specific hypotheses, as a way of attacking this most complex and wonderful of problems. How do brains put themselves together? How do they work so well so much of the time, and why do they stop doing that when problems of mental health arise? So, you know, we continue to fly this plane even as we're building it, but what else is new? That's always the case. And this data sharing, which I've touched on, is becoming more and more the rule. These days, you can be a first-rate scientist and sit at your computer, if you have an internet connection, and download data or do all your analyses on the cloud, because some of these data sets are too large to download. And so increasingly, that kind of big data science is going to be how we begin to understand what's going on. And the more we understand, the more compelling case we'll be able to make for why the resources need to be more appropriately allocated. So thank you very much. I want to mention Adriana DiMartino, Mike Millen, Don and Rochelle Klein, and the Brain and Behavior Research Foundation. Thank you.
Questions for Dr. Castellanos?
Great talk. Thank you.
Thank you.
I don't know whether this is on, but I can yell.
Well, put it up so that just in case
All
I can
right.
hear you.
Do anti-seizure medications, anti-epileptic medications affect this clinically or in the imaging studies?
Almost certainly, these intrinsic connectivity networks, which is what we typically call them, are affected by everything. But figuring out how they're affected, requires the kinds of studies that you know about, on and off, and time of day, and all of this. So my guess is the answer would be yes, but how systematically they're affected, I can't tell you at this point. We know that they're affected by neuroleptics, that we've done studies on stimulants. They're affected by antidepressants in different ways. And yet, there's parts of them that are so robust that they're there when we're asleep, when we're anesthetized. So it's a complex, multi-layered phenomenon. Who has the mic? It's like the talking stick.
Oh, yes. I have a question about the default mode, and you say that in ADHD, the network works differently. I just was wondering, in what way specifically does it work differently? What are the different regions that are engaged or offline in ADHD versus normal?
Thank you. So the default network, as I said, it's a fascinating mystery. And as everything in the body, it has a developmental trajectory. And so it's actually present in the fetus, but in a much more rudimentary way. And in a newborn, again, you can just sort of barely make it out. By 1 year of age, it looks almost like it does in adults. It is very little different from 1 to 2 years of age in a qualitative way. There are going to be quantitative differences, unquestionably, but there are studies looking at newborns, 1-year-olds, and 2-year-olds that are longitudinal, the same children followed over that period of time, so we can be more definitive about that. And part of what happens with maturation is that it becomes more integrated so that these front and back regions become more coherent. And part of what ADHD and some other disorders seem to be about is less coherence between the front and the back, as I showed you. There are also, with some statistical processes factored in, as I sort of alluded to, there are these complex relationships between areas of the brain that we know are very involved in paying attention or focusing our attention or helping us to inhibit. We call them the cognitive control, the executive function areas. And there seems to be a kind of back and forth between the default and those cognitive control areas. And the thought is that perhaps the body, the brain, kind of fluctuates between paying attention to what's going on out there. Is there food that I could eat, or am I going to turn into someone's dinner? Scanning every now and then checking inside. So there's a kind of alternation between introspection and extrospection. That's the hypothesis. And in healthy individuals, that's a very beautiful correlation. We've measured that correlation, and it's as high as 0.98 in people who were the most consistent when they were doing one of those reaction time tasks. So that's almost perfect. Right? But the degree of that varies across people, and it turns out that how well coordinated that interplay between the default network and the other networks is also varies in ADHD. And so there's a bit more sloppiness, there's a bit more variability, again, in the way in which the brain is organized in individuals with ADHD, which especially in situations where you want normative behavior, i.e. a classroom, kind of gets you out of, you're out of the mainstream. I'm kind of torn about the idea that in some situations ADHD is good. I tend to think that that's oversold for the most part in our current world. On the other hand, I can see some value across human time. And we know, again, that adolescence is a period of time of being more adventuresome and more novelty-seeking and taking more risks. And, for the individual, that may not always be a good thing. But for the community, it may result in benefits. And so that may be part of why these traits have maintained over the eons. But that's a short and very allegorical story about the default network. I wouldn't say it's quantitative.
Thank you.
Yes.
Great. Excellent presentation.